This meeting is being recorded.
Greetings, everyone. I am Syed Ali Jaffrey, and I welcome you to another episode of the CISPR webinar series, which aims to bring to you quality discussions on strategic security and foreign policy issues. In his 1960 classic entitled The Strategy of Conflict, Thomas Schelling delves into the concepts of limited war, tacit bargaining, and focal points. He writes, limited wars require limits, so do strategic maneuvers if they are to be stabilized short of war. Schelling's ideas have been admired and critiqued alike by many a scholar. Today, with the advent of disruptive technologies, many of his framings can be challenged, especially when they are applied to complex nuclear tinged equations. Dr. Zachary Davis's new novel entitled Above Scorched Skies, a story of modern warfare and world power, which happens to be a gripping fictional portrayal of unbridled escalation, gives us a lot of room to rethink about Schelling's compelling enunciations. And today we have Dr. Zachary Davis with us to talk about the book. Dr. Zachary S. Davis is a senior fellow at the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory and a research professor at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, where he guest teaches courses on counterproliferation. Davis's scholarly publications include articles in Orbis, Asia Survey, Arms Control Today, Security Studies, and the American Interest, and chapters in numerous edited volumes. He was the editor of the widely read 1993 book, The Proliferation Puzzle: Why States Proliferate and What Results. His edited book on the 2002 South Asia crisis, The Indo-Pak Military Standoff, was published by Palgrave Macmillan. He is the editor of several recent books on emerging technology like Strategic Latency and World Power, How Technology is Changing Our Concepts of Security, Strategic Latency, Red, White, and Blue, Managing the National and International Security Consequences of Disruptive Technologies, and Strategic Latency Unleashed, Emerging Technologies for Space Operations Force. Uh, Thank you so much, Dr. Davis, for joining me on this episode. It's always a pleasure to talk to you and listen to your rich insights on deterrence, especially in the context of South Asia. Um, so, as I mentioned in my introduction, um, you have recently penned a novel which talks about the rapidity and unpredictability of escalation. Uh, so, for the benefit of our audience upfront, I would like to request you to give us a sense of the book. Tell us why, from writing books on proliferation and the Twin Peaks crisis, you ended up writing a novel on South Asia, which does not remain limited to South Asia. It talks about space warfare, which greatly affects lives in the U.S., China, and Russia. So tell us this journey, and also how can fiction help us look at the future, which is very it's very unpredictable. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. Thanks for inviting me to join you in your podcast, and I appreciate what you're doing to try and get the ideas, the concepts that we deal with in our professional lives out, to the broader audience, and that's really the essence of what I was trying to do with the book. But let me go back and sort of identify the pieces of the puzzle that came together in the book, and why I wrote a novel instead of another academic article or book about what we do. Because, of course, in my job, right, we look at deterrence and warfare and diplomacy, and how all of these complex ingredients come together to shape the world that we're living in. And I have two main pathways that have kind of stuck with me throughout my career. And one is the nuclear, and perhaps you could extend that to the broader strategic weapons studies, and looking at nuclear weapons and nuclear states and nuclear proliferation and arms control and all of those things that go into that complex field. And that all builds around the deterrence and defense set of concepts. The other part of my background has been South Asia. So I'm a South Asianist, and over the years, that's how I know you and your mentors and my friends throughout the region. And I've traveled there, and in the last 10 or so years, we've developed a series of war games or tabletop exercises to try and help all of us, experts, retired military, retired policy, retired diplomats from all three of the countries, India, Pakistan, the United States. And we get experts together, and we've been doing this for a long time so that we've developed relationships. And so we have a sense that we're speaking clearly to one another about what really matters, and not gaming each other or playing games to try and fool people or manipulate the way we think about it. But we have an honest relationship amongst these experts from all three countries about the evolution of deterrence in South Asia and how it's morphing and evolving. So we have honest conversations about that. So there's the deterrence component, and then there's the South Asia component. But one thing that was made all of this more complex was the issue of emerging and disruptive technologies. And so the world isn't what it used to be when Schelling and Herman Kahn and Bernard Brodie and all the great thinkers of the nuclear age didn't really take into account a lot of the things that are kind of shaping the world that we're living in. I don't think they could have comprehended. And so nuclear used to kind of live in a world by itself. And it was somewhat of a gap between the conventional warfare and the way we thought about regional conflict, and the firebreak between conventional and nuclear war. These are often thought of as two separate worlds. But with the prevalence and, in a way, the democratization of emerging technologies, that gap between these worlds has closed and has kind of changed the dynamic for everyone. So a project that I've been running on behalf of the Center for Global Security Research and the lab where I work is what we call strategic latency, right? And you can call that emerging and disruptive technologies. There's lots of ways that you can characterize this emergence of and prevalence of technology in really all parts of our life. So it's not just limited to the battlefield or warfare. It's really become the age of technology, and it's really reshaped the way we think about deterrence, and particularly this notion of complex or integrated. In Pakistan, it's called full spectrum. But lots of, we're just developing the terminology for it. And in a talk I gave with your mentor and my friend Rabia Akhtar recently, I commended the idea that Pakistan should come up with its own terminology for these things, because it's an open field. And things are changing so rapidly and so unpredictably that we are in a kind of a new form of deterrence. And the what we used to refer to as the nth body problem, right, or the 3-body problem, or the 2-body, however you want to think about it. The theories of the past don't really address the complexity, either in terms of the players involved, right? There are more players involved, and for the United States, it's deterrence fully recognizing China as a peer competitor. That's new. And Russia reimagining its nuclear stance. So that's changing. And then the other players, right? So then we've got North Korea and some other players. In South Asia, there's something similar, right? There's a 3-body problem fully engaged now. And it's of a type that has not been seen before. So what I tried to do in the book, and I'll talk about why I wrote it as a novel instead of another academic book, but what I tried to do in the book was to take all of this complexity, all right, and all of the dynamics, and throw them into a real life scenario, right? To throw them into what could actually play out. And you asked a really good question, which is, what is this new genre? And people call it, fictional intelligence or useful fiction. There's been quite a little renaissance in this genre of books. Now, some people would say they trace it back to maybe, Tom Clancy and these techno thrillers of the Cold War or of the counterterrorism world. So it's a very fast-moving field and very interesting. And the reason for it, that's my dog Maverick, and he's saying hello to people that he sees. And I wish he wouldn't do that, but he doesn't listen to me. So this fictional accounts of current problems enables us to try out scenarios, realistic ideas, and to project them, right? So there's an ongoing interest in prediction, right? And we see this in, lots of fields, are investing in this idea of prediction. And more realistically, it's called forecasting. But in the private sector, in the government, it's a sort of popular thing to try and project out, where are these technologies going? What's the trajectory of technology? What is the trajectory of the world interactions, world politics? Where are they going? How do we see? Well, of course we don't know, and of course these are ridiculous questions. Not to be unfair to people, but I personally, as a international relations scholar and political scientist, have deep reservations about the validity of predictive methodologies. But what we can do, and what can form the basis of a conversation, is to tell some stories, right? Storytelling, the oldest of our, the oldest way to communicate that we know of. And it's something that we all do, right? It's cross-cultural, it's global, it's what people do, it's what humans do. We tell stories to try and communicate and to convey ideas. So I decided that the best way to capture all the complexity that has come in terms of technology and the global situation was to tell a story. Was to tell a story, and this is a story about South Asia, and in a way, it's a story about why South Asia matters, because we tend to, in the U.S. and in the current thinking, not really pay much attention to the South Asian component of this big human story. But I think that's a mistake. And I wanted to make sure that people realize how critical, central the South Asian story is to our human story. Um, I think it's at our peril if we don't really include the South Asian story. And as a South Asia scholar myself, of course, right? I think that's important. And so I wanted to tell that story. I'm sorry, and I've got some feedback, and it's fair. Not everyone in this story comes out as a hero. So let me talk a little bit about my heroes. So my heroes are a young and diverse in terms of race, gender, and background. And so my heroes are young people because I want to convey this story not to the same people that I always talk to, not to my community, not to my usual, the people that we read and meet with and at conferences, sit on panels. And I wanted to get outside of our usual audience. I wanted to reach a more diverse, global group of people that don't normally read our stuff, right? They don't read the articles that you write, and they don't read the articles that I write. They just don't. And they don't read the books that I write on strategic latency. They don't really read academic books, but they might read a story, and they might relate to some characters that are more like them. And so I wanted to, instead of make it about a bunch of, frankly, old white male scientists, about a bunch of young people of today's mentality, of today's culture, who are faced with the inheritance of the nuclear age, right? And I wanted also to include the fact that the deterrence challenge now is far more complex than it was in an earlier time. And that is largely because of the addition of these emerging technologies, the main ones being relatable, right, to a global audience, which is cyber, of course. What does cyber do? And you've seen in our world, right, where there's been a bunch of recent scholarship about the effects of emerging technologies on nuclear command and control, and that does this help deterrence or does it undermine deterrence? The effects of artificial intelligence on nuclear command and control structures. Does it, undermine stability? Does it strengthen deterrence? These are good questions. So the cyber world opened up all kinds of possibilities that are more relatable to a younger, more diverse audience. And then add on top of that space, right? And we have quietly become completely dependent on space, not just for the military realm, but also for pretty much everything you do in normal everyday life. So we don't really think about our dependency on space. And I wanted to call attention to that, right? And the fragility, and what a term that we use in our field, which applies, I think, very appropriately here, is the entanglement, right? The entanglement between the military world and the civilian life, the commercial, economic life of normal, everyday people. And so we're all kind of caught up and bound together in ways that we haven't really thought about, right? We are entangled. We're entangled globally. We're entangled in the deterrence space. We're the conventional warfare is entangled with nuclear systems now. And so we are very much entangled. And so I wrote the story to try and put a group of relatable young people into the current context, into the way, not the way that we think of it academically, but into the way that seems to make sense for most people, right? For regular people your age, younger people. And then there's a subtext, right? There's a method to my madness. And part of that is I would really like uh, to entice your generation, more people from the younger generation and from the more diverse backgrounds to come into our national security field and to repopulate our field with new ideas. And this is where your mentor Rabia Akhtar and I are very much of a similar mind, because she's doing that as well, is making an effort to try and bring more people into the field, make it more diverse, bring more women, bring more people of color, bring different perspectives, because this world now being entangled affects everyone in ways that maybe it was easier, uh, to ignore, but no longer. And the space component that really is at the heart of the book uh, shows that we all have a stake in this, and that our brain power, our united brain power, is necessary to get us out of it. So I was, in a way, writing a recruitment document to try and invite and make interesting this field that, it's interesting to you, it's interesting to me,
You,
but,
you,
but I want more people to find it interesting.
I think when I was reading the book, I did not think about this recruitment component, but you have, among the things that you've put on the table, this is one of the most compelling ones from this answer. Yes, so you really um, mentioned, you perfectly talked about how the original framings of deterrence need to be reconceptualized. And if we look at the idea of deterrence and how the deterrence theory, especially the one propounded by Thomas Schelling, was critiqued by the third wave of deterrence theorists, and they were like, no, the second wave theorists have not done a proper job of theorizing deterrence. They're just assuming a lot of things deductively, and they were like, no, let's focus on inductive reasoning and
Right.
ignore deductive reasoning. And I think if we read the book, you don't directly mention that, but a lot of what you say in the book about space and about and how certain things that are more valuable on the ground are not that valuable at space. Now that really tells us, takes us back to that third wave critique on deterrence, that the rational deterrence theory, which assumes the perfection of rationality is not is not a good explainer, and also is not a good, it does not lend good support to policy. Obviously those scholars were talking about US policy, but it really applies to other policy, other countries policies as well, especially in this day and age. So you talked about uh, creating new terminology for nuclear deterrence, and for nuclear, we need to have a nuclear lexicon. In Pakistan, we have been, Dr. Akhtar has been toying with this idea for a long, long time, and just
Yeah.
a couple of weeks ago, she launched this decolonizing social sciences in Pakistan project. So we will obviously be looking at this strategic studies, but within the broader ambit of social sciences. So that's something very important, I believe. So my next question, which branches out of what you've said, is you mentioned Herman Khan, and like I just mentioned a couple of seconds ago, the terminology. Uh, South Asians, uh, South Asians, both at the policy and academic realms, have really been fixated on Cold War nuclear jargons. I don't think South Asia's geographic uh, composition allows for any ladder, let alone a 44 rung ladder. So, given what is written in the book about space and about how rapidly escalation could take place, how do you look at this, the applicability or lack thereof of the Cold War deterrence escalation architecture that we all have read and internalized over many decades?
Yeah, so much there. You threw me a lot to jump into. Let me uh, one word of caution about creating national identity-based lexicons. I do think it's important for us to be able to have a common language. And so one of the things that you see in many academic fields is a kind of a tribalization of language. And I personally would react negatively to the idea of decolonizing uh, the lexicon. And the reason for that is that this is causing divisions. Now, people could argue that they're important divisions, that these are valid divisions, that we see it differently and our perspective is different, and we have ours and you have yours. I think that divides us, and it's going to make it hard for us to communicate. And so I would rather and I think you're doing this by talking to me, and I think actually, from what I see of the trends going on in our field, that we are communicating across boundaries, but we need to not build up separate lexicons, and particularly not based on grievance or contention or old. No, let's stay together and sort this out. And I think we can all agree that the old terminologies, which developed out of the Cold War and out of the nuclear age, and for a lot of complex reasons, came out of the largely U.S., but the U.S. Soviet experience and the efforts to come to terms with deterrence as we knew it. But I don't think it's productive for us to start throwing that away and putting judgments on it. I think it's worth evolving and taking those terms and applying them to the new circumstance and doing that together, right? So when I say that it's a good idea for people to start working on a new lexicon, it's in the context of a common understanding, and all of us scholars doing that, right? And the young people coming in and saying, well, let's try this and add that. It needs to be updated for sure, but I don't think going down the decolonization path, because that is prescriptive. I can tell you and I could, in a few minutes, do the decolonized lexicon, right, for nuclear studies. It doesn't get us where we need to go. And it's just going to create silos that then we'll argue about. And that's not what we need to do. But what you went back to one of the fundamental principles that we should be arguing about, and what was behind a lot of that old scholarship and our previous Cold War efforts to come to terms with the nuclear age. And that is the rational actor, right? A lot of this is, remember, Schelling was an economist. And a lot of the theories that we developed about the nuclear age uh, we're based on the assumption of a rational actor theory, and and you know that's worth questioning, and it does come back to the fundamentals of our field, and we were speaking about earlier before the interview started about some of the fundamentals of international relations, being decision making and how decision making works, and cross cultural studies, and strategic culture, and how decision making is. And this is also something that your professor Jeff Knopf has really done a sort of the leading work on, right? Is organizations, individuals, where is nuclear decision making grounded, and does that change? And can we always assume rational actors? And this gets into the whole, when you're talking about deterrence, stability, this complexity leads you back to the work of people like Scott Sagan, um, who long ago said, there's just too much room for error here. that these are complex systems, and
Limits of
whether the
safety,
systems malfunction or the people, human error, or Murphy's law, or a misunderstanding, or there could be language, or there could be timing, or there could be so many intangible variables that you hadn't accounted for, that it's just not a stable structure, right? I think that is a mainstream idea that still pertains and may be getting more worrisome as the complexity grows. That when you add all these other domains, space, cyber, AI, quantum, whatever else you want to throw in there, um, it's more of a challenge to human decision making, and that includes at the individual level, the group level, the national level, or the international level, right? The anarchic society that Hedley Bull talked about. No matter how you cut it, complexity doesn't make it makes some things easier, but it makes some things harder. And I hope that's where we focus our attention, and not redefining the wrongs of the powerful, and exploitation of the weak by the strong. I don't really think that's the way to go. I don't think that we should divide up by national. I don't think we should divide up by gender. I don't think we should divide up by any sort of. I think we need to do this together. I really do. I think that uh, scholars, young people from the whole world need to take this on as theirs, and redefine this stuff, not in terms of righting the wrongs of I mean, that's, I'm dancing around it so as not to become political in an unproductive way, but I really don't think that creating new silos, or prosecuting a sort of colonial perspective is the right way to approach this problem, because it's all of our problem. And I would rather see you guys take it and run with it and redefine it, rather than continue with some old battles that don't get us.
I think you raised a very good point about old battles and all, but I have a slightly different take on it. By decolonization, we basically mean we need to indigenize knowledge. South Asians should write about indigenous South Asian things which are ingrained in the cultural ethos of the area. That's important also. I think for young social scientists in South Asia, or specifically in Pakistan, it's important that they do not take every concept on face value without contextualizing it. contextualizing every concept, tacit bargaining, focal points, each and everything has to be contextualized in the context of in line with South Asian um, peculiar dynamics. As I said earlier, we just cannot have a 44 rung escalatory ladder in South Asia. We don't have that geographic
Right.
space. So, but until unless, and the idea behind projects like this is that you should, and I would uh, quote Dr. Rabia here, and she always says, you should critique your favorite scholar.
Yeah.
You should have the ability and the capacity to critique your favorite scholar. And it dovetails nicely with what we were talking before the interview. You can only critique Schelling, let's say, or Mearsheimer by reading them
Yeah.
extensively. You cannot critique them without engaging with their core ideas. So this is something very this is a nuance that we are trying to bring to the table, and your conversations with our fellows a couple of weeks ago were really instructive in that regard, and we look forward to more engagements with you on that. Um, the bulk of your book indirectly talks about one of the most pressing problems that the nuclear space faces today, which is arms control. Um, you briefly touched upon that in the lecture that you gave to our fellows previously, but there is a problem. Arms control is a big problem that the US and the Chinese and the Russians are facing. I can recall the late Michael Crepon's last book, a voluminous account on the history of arms control. He talked about creating a seven-country band where all those seven countries could talk about arms control and talk about non-proliferation.
Yeah.
But uh, I think you dedicate 6 to 7 chapters uh, a on a treaty which talks about rehabilitating the space. So, in light of that discussion on space and on arms control and on creating norms, how do you look at the current arms control challenge that the world is grappling with?
Yeah. Great. Really tough question, Ali. Uh, so let me connect that question to what we were just speaking about, and that is this sort of indigenous knowledge, um, which I think is quite relevant. But what I would say, if you're going to contextualize the whole, strategic challenges that are faced on a national and then regional and global basis, and so this kind of connects to the track two meetings and the war games that we've been doing for, oh gosh, uh, my partner Feroz Khan and I have been running these for about 20 years now, 25 years maybe. And the point of those, has been to try and get this kind of conversation started on a regional basis. And in South Asia, if you're going to redefine the fundamentals of strategic security, and you're going to redefine arms control as a means of managing the long-term strategic competition, then the starting point has to be Indians and Pakistanis together doing it bilaterally. That's the starting point. And that's why we always strive to include, really with, and this has been misunderstood, I think, by some, and particularly, in some governmental levels, have misunderstood the point of these exercises. It's not to promulgate U.S. ideas. We understand fully, that those ideas are not universally applicable, and that there's a South Asian context. So a primary objective has been, and you mentioned my, dear friend and mentor, Michael Crapon, right? I mean, I'm channeling his spirit right now to say that Indians and Pakistanis have to embrace concepts relevant to their circumstances for managing nuclear competition and defining South Asian deterrence. And arms control is going to be a primary, right? We talk about nuclear learning in South Asia, right? And we've done articles and books and meetings. It's our 5th year, it's our 10th year, it's our 20th year, it's our 25th year. We're moving along, right? Those tests were in 1998. We need, I think, for India and Pakistan to define arms control that is relevant for the bilateral deterrence relationship, and it's frankly past time. And there are a lot of complex reasons. We can talk about that, but I completely agree that you need an indigenization of arms control to the specific circumstances of nuclear competition in South Asia. That it's a dream of mine. It was a dream of Michael Crapon's, and I know it's a dream of many of the people and frankly the sponsors of our Track 2 and the sponsors of our TTXs and war games. That is really the goal, is to try and support and what can you say, prime the pump of new thinking on arms control for South Asia. That would be just and because it's getting so complex now, right? And that's why we talk about the new triad of the other three-body problem, right? Which is the role of China in the South Asian context. Really adds a new dimension to this, and this is something I talk with my Pakistani colleagues and friends about quite a lot, is that the Chinese contribution to deterrence in South Asia is not in all cases stabilizing, right? It's not helping. And India's preoccupation with China's growing role in that triad, in the triangular N-body problem, is not making things any easier. And so, I would love to see some initiative, and that's why you hear me harp on this idea of Lahore too, right? We need to get back to, and I would say, even though the history has been difficult and the leaders have not in all cases embraced, these concepts, but in the Lahore document, these two leaders in very tense times and with their own domestic problems somehow managed to overcome all of this and made a tremendous step in the right direction. And this is a model that we should build on. We should follow up on that. And it was not at the behest of the United States. And so the United States was not urging or leading. This was something that came indigenously. And those documents and the confidence building measures that derived from the Lahore meeting are indigenous. All right, and you and I both know who wrote those documents, and it was an act of tremendous courage, I thought, and it was exactly. I mean, it was so insightful, and so getting back to, reimagining a Lahore 2 for the times that we're in, and if that somehow could manage you know, the beginnings of arms control, bilateral arms control, for South Asia, I would die a happy man. Of course, the problem is that adding new domains, right? So the space and cyber makes the problem, which is already a wicked problem, just so much more complicated that I think that we could be forgiven if we just carved off the nuclear piece and didn't engage the full complexities of the space and cyber domains, because those are, frankly, I think, proving intractable for the imagining new norms, right? I don't think we're going to get new treaties, and I think it's a kind of a waste of time to imagine space treaties or cyber treaties. That horse left the barn. That cat's out of the bag. That's done.
Yes,
And
the cat
chasing
is
after
actually
that,
out of the bag,
you know,
unfortunately.
you're not going to get any sort of arms control treaties that could be either verifiable or much less enforceable. And so we got to go with what's within our reach, and it's nuclear confidence building measures are fully achievable, right? And I've heard it from you and from your colleagues and from your mentors and from the people that I work with in both countries. Everyone knows what we got to do, right? You can do it, but it's got to be, as you rightly said, indigenous. It has to come from the region, and it has to come from from the leaders of your field, based on the needs of India and Pakistan. So all of this starts with you and your Indian counterparts talking with each other, right? That's the key here is more bilateral communication.
Communication of any kind and type is better than no communication at all.
Absolutely. So, so meetings, it doesn't matter what the meetings are about, right? They don't have to be on nuclear security. Get together with colleagues and people in your sort of community, in your age group, scholars, activists, and there needs to be more interaction between Indians and Pakistanis. And I know that I know the reasons why this is difficult, but that's kind of the work that we have before us is to find opportunities for that, to create opportunities for young people to be sitting down together. And you always, I mean, that's one of the hallmarks of our track twos, right? And that's how you know you've had a successful track two, when the Pakistani and the Indian young people take off and go out to dinner by themselves and leave us old
Yes.
U.S. white guys, by ourselves. That, like, this is good, right? You guys belong together. You guys get along together. It's it's silly, not to form an alliance,
And
to
I think
redefine and indigenize. And yeah, you want to create arms control, and I can name the team, and you and me could sit down and set this agenda in 25 minutes, right?
we can and we certainly must. I do believe that there is a glimmer of hope. In fact, more than a glimmer of hope. We look at what's happening in Zaporizhia. We look at uh, how badly Russia and the US are treating their problem, treating this whole issue. But then we look at South Asia and how the non-attack agreement of 1988 is still intact, despite the fact that both countries after that tested nuclear weapons. They had Kargil, they had a number of other crises. Yet the non-attack agreement and a number of other nuclear CBMs and NLRMs are still intact. It's something that the world should learn from South Asia. I know there were issues. There was the 2022 missile launched by India. There was the 2019 Pulwama crisis, which was, by the way, very dangerous. And I would end my series of questions with that. Um, and I know crisis management on part of the US has been a very important factor in managing crises. Yet it is important to acknowledge that both countries have, to a certain degree, internalized deterrence. That is changing, and this is where my last question comes in. Uh, 2019, we saw what happened. Pulwama happened, then India became the first nuclear armed country to launch an airstrike on another nuclear armed on a bona fide territory of another nuclear armed country. So that was the first. It got all deterrence watchers quite interested and intrigued. But what happened afterwards was a bit you know challenging for everyone. One, Pakistan gave a conventional response, and a very good one at that, and a very measured one at that, rather.
Yep.
That was not what the US scholars had calculated. Second, it was India that wanted to escalate to the next level. And when I say escalate to the next level, uh, I'm alluding to the threat of missile strikes. Now, as of now, we don't have the capability of ascertaining as to whether an incoming missile has a nuclear warhead or a conventional warhead. So
Yeah.
when missilery between two nuclear armed countries who are geographically so close is a big no-no. So now you add AI, you add quantum computing, you add space satellites and whatnot. What, according to you, a future Indo-Pak crisis could look like? I know you talked about that in the book, but
Yeah.
for the benefit of our audience, just give a rundown of how this could pan out.
Yeah. So that's been the focus of our war game series, of our TTXs, and we have built scenarios for the game, right? So a lot of care goes into developing a realistic scenario. And one of the first principles of war games is that the players, the participants, always start fighting against the scenario. We would never do that. Yeah, but that's what happened in 2019, right? This is exactly what happened. Oh no, that would never happen. Yeah, it happened. Yeah, you didn't think it would happen, but it happened, right? And this is particularly the case with like accidents and misperceptions. They're like, oh no, we've got this all figured out. No, you don't. Remember what happened? And so we try to war game these scenarios that are real. And the whole sort of focus has been escalation, crisis management, and hopefully then de-escalation. Right? That's the objective to stable deterrence is de-escalation. And so, unfortunately, the lesson of the TTXs, the tabletop exercises and the war games, has not been encouraging, right? I mean, it is fairly routine now that misperception rules the day. Unfortunately, these crises when you model them and you create scenarios and you put people in the position of having to cope with a crisis that's realistic, and you give them realistic responsibilities, right? And we can talk about some sort of the field of wargaming, which is undergoing all kinds of interesting evolution. But our war games are kind of old school in that we put people, selected people who have knowledge of previous crises and who have either studied them or been involved in them, in the military, in the governments. And unfortunately, the outcomes have been universally troubling, and that when real people are put in these stressful situations, they do tend to rush to judgment, and they do make rash decisions, and they do feel the need to respond, and they do feel the need to respond forcefully, and unfortunately, and this is the key to what you were talking about, rapidly. And maybe one of the big takeaways is the importance of moving away from things like launch on warning, understanding that no one places much credibility on declaratory policies. I mean, you can say anything you want, but when these crises occur, people really don't believe like a no first use declaration. That doesn't really come into play. I mean, they're just cast aside. And one of the most troubling things, and you mentioned it, is the dual use nature of many of the delivery systems, right? You don't really know what you're dealing with, especially with some of the missile systems that are being employed. This is increasingly the case in the maritime domain, that you just don't know what kind of payload is coming, and this was the case in the last war game we did, that people felt a need to react quickly and forcefully to reinforce deterrence. And that leads to escalation, right? Right, because then the other side, and so that leads you back to, and Michael Crapon and the books that he wrote, and the Lahore document, and the discussion around communication, hotlines, agreements, and they don't have to be, deeply consequential in terms of verification or getting rid of classes of weapons. But one thing that could happen that is within reach, and both countries have the capability to do it, and they don't need anybody else to do it. But we have done some mock missile retirement scenarios, and we actually did some mock missile verification exercises that only require a cell phone, and you could do on-site inspections of some of the retired missiles that both sides are moving beyond their first generation missiles. And so there are older systems that are being retired. They will not be relifed. They don't contribute to the modern arsenals. They don't play a significant role in modern deterrence. They're outdated. They're funky, and both sides need to get rid of. That's normal. It could be a point of pride, and you could do a verified disarmament of old missiles, right? And simply could be sending cell phone photos of smashing up these old systems, or taking their motors out, or so there's a lot of places you could start to try to create the kind of communication. I mean, we always go back to the hotlines. Uh, that is their easy pickings, right? You could do that. And that actually could be tremendously valuable in a crisis to say, hey, I hope you didn't understand. So that was a disappointment in Pulwama. That was a disappointment, right? I mean, the hotlines have been a source of disappointment for everyone, but they don't have to be. And the fact that they have not been fully utilized up to this point does not mean that they're that it's the wrong approach. I still believe that the hotlines is a really useful approach in putting leaders in touch with one another, but even more importantly, leaders who have met and talked to each other. And we find this in the military to military, from time to time, that the military leaders are comfortable with each other. Sometimes the diplomats, right? Sometimes the diplomats have met and talked and had tea and know each other. So talking to one another in the midst of a crisis is a really useful way to get this arms control or crisis management or de-escalation, which is, this is the heart of the matter, right? Getting out of a situation and rectifying the misunderstandings before they turn into, we had this in our last war game, I have to say, and this was an avoidable crisis if people would only talk to each other. So I'm going to go back to where we started, which is, you and your people, and we need to get the NGOs to fund more opportunities for you and your generation to meet, go to Wilton Park, go to all these places, meet and talk with your contemporaries about all of this stuff, and start socializing it and pushing it and developing it and showing how it could be done, because it can be done, it should be done. I just think that
Think
we can't give up.
we should never give up. There's no option. We just can't give up. And I think if there is one thing that your book, if there's one takeaway that I would like to highlight from your book, it will be that talking, communicating, and interacting are the only ways to navigate what you have brilliantly mentioned in one of your chapters, the fog of war. And the fog of war, from the time it was conceptualized by Clausewitz, it has morphed, it has evolved into something very dangerous now. And if anyone wants to get a sense of those dangers, I would definitely recommend them to read your novel, which is available online freely, and it's available as a print and a hard copy. So thank you for showing this book to our audience. I definitely will recommend, and I am recommending it to many a person out there. So thank you very much once again for joining me in this conversation. It was an absolute pleasure. I look forward to engaging with you further. So that's it for this episode. I look forward to engaging with other scholars like Dr. Davis going forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ali. It's a pleasure.